Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a very exciting panel of the day that we know a lot of our participants asked for specifically. So let's get right into it. This panel is focused on best practices for procurement and specifically joint procurement of zero emissions buses in North America and Europe. There's been a lot of dialogue in recent months and over the last 12 months in particular about bringing costs down through volume purchasing, coordinated purchasing, and specifically standardized and interoperable procurement. So with us today to talk about this burgeoning opportunity is Steve Clermont, I think I pronounced it again in the French mode, Director of Planning and Deployment at the Center for Transportation and the Environment in the US, Lisa Jerram, Director of Bus Programming and Emerging Vehicle Technologies at the American Public Transit Association, and Mike Dolman, Associate Director at Element Energy. And some of you may be familiar with Element Energy, coordinating the Jive network for hydrogen bus joint procurement in Europe. We're excited to have you all with us here today. I know there's a lot of insights. So with that, I'm going to turn over, Steve, to yourself first to kick us off with your insights to provide some context and dialogue for this particular topic.
Terrific. Thank you, Josipa, and thank you to CUTRIC for having me on this panel today. It's very exciting to be with everyone. Again, my name is Steve Clermont. I'm the Director of Planning and Deployment for CTE, the Center for Transportation and the Environment. I'll be representing both CTE and ZEBRA, the Zero Emission Bus Alliance, in our conversation today. A little bit about CTE. We are a nonprofit organization based out of Atlanta, Georgia. Our mission is to improve the health of our climate and communities. And we do that by focusing on zero emission transportation technology specifically. We've been around for about 27 years, starting out with hybrid technology in the early 90s. But now our efforts are totally on zero emission vehicles. We have a specific focus on transit because transit is a very good market to conduct research and demonstration and deployment of clean zero emission technologies. We do have several offices across the US, and we do projects in both the US and Canada. I also want to introduce or make sure you're aware of an organization called ZEBRA, the Zero Emission Bus Resource Alliance. They are entirely transit-based organization. The members of ZEBRA are transit agencies only. CTE does some administrative and research work for them on request, but their entire focus is to exchange information with other transit agencies. So if you are a transit agency and are interested in learning a little bit about this organization, please reach out to me and I can put you in contact with them, or you can reach out to them on their website. CTE, I mentioned before, we have a focus in the transit market. We've probably worked with well over 70 transit agencies with either their deployment of zero emission buses or their planning around zero emission buses. And more recently, it's been focusing on transition planning. How do we move a fleet from, say, their current pilot projects to 100% zero emission? So joint procurements, we have participated or helped several agencies with joint procurements. There are some challenges associated with it, but easily overcome. And probably the biggest challenges have to do with the differences in performance characteristics that the vehicles have for each agency. So battery electric buses will perform differently in different environments because that depends on the route or block mileage, the speed of the route, the topography, the traffic that they engage in, and the climate that they operate in. So what works for one agency may not necessarily work for another agency. So that's something that you need to consider in a joint procurement. Typically would have a single agency being that lead to communicate what their requirements are. The participating agencies would then define what their requirements are that may be different from the first agency. But then once you get responses, the lead agency would then make their selection the participating agencies should also go through and do their own evaluation, because again, whatever the lead agency selects may not necessarily work for the participating agencies in this joint procurement. As an example of one joint procurement that we did between Clemson Area Transit and Santa Cruz Metro, Clemson Area Transit was the lead agency, and they selected Proterra 40-foot buses with 440 kilowatt-hour battery pack. That particular model didn't work for Santa Cruz, but they were able to do their own evaluation afterwards and select the Proterra 40-foot with the 660 kilowatt-hour pack. So it worked out well for both agencies, and even though they didn't need to buy the exact same model, they were able to buy the model that fit their route characteristics. One other challenge to think about would be the inclusion of charging infrastructure. And again, the same issue here. Different chargers may have different attributes that may not work for each agency. So that evaluation needs to be done as well after the lead agency makes their selection. I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Great overview. And we're certainly going to come back to that point. I think there'll be questions on the line there about what's the impact on volume pricing if, in fact, agencies do go to different battery sizes on the same model. So stay tuned, Steve. We'll be back to you for queries on that. With that, we're going to segue over to Lisa Jerram, who's been leading the eBus programming at APTA for several years now, and really, starting to develop those guidelines around standardization that helps to move to procurement. We're in a different world in 2020 with standards issued compared to 4 years ago. So Lisa, over to you to take us through the contextual insight that you'd like to provide there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. I think my mic is a little quiet, but let me know if you can't hear me very well.
No, we can. And I just see, Lisa, for some reason, your slide deck's not appearing. So just bear with us for a minute. There we go.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Yes. Well, thank you. I do appreciate being invited, and I've enjoyed your conference this week. I've attended a number of sessions. I think they've been really good, and I know you all are kind of at the forefront of doing this virtually. We'll be doing that ourselves at APTA, so it's been great to do that. So yeah, I'll just tell you, for those of you who don't know much about APTA, we're an industry association, of course, representing the transit industry. It does say here we're the oldest and largest in North America. I should maybe tweak that language when I'm presenting to a Canadian audience. But in any case, we do represent the US and, of course, Canadian agencies. But really, most importantly, is that we are strong advocates for public transit, which is especially important. It's always important. It's especially important right now. And another key role that we have is helping our members with a range of issues that they need to address, but in particular, navigating some new challenges. So COVID, of course, has been front and center, but also electric buses. The transition to zero emission buses has been a really important topic for me in my role as the bus director. All right, so I'm going to tell you first off about a document. This is sort of what APTA has done around procurement for buses. And this actually long predates electric buses. This is actually, and this is a document that long predates my involvement officially as an employee at APTA, our standard bus procurement guidelines. And it's a very long document. It's about a 300-page document. And it was developed initially, I think maybe about a decade ago, and then revised about 5 years ago. And in fact, we are now coming up to looking at a full revision of this again, happening very shortly. But so one of the points I want to make about it, though, is that, we're talking about joint procurements and what benefit they can provide is sort of in terms of standardization. Even though the word standard comes up here when I talk about this document, even this really wasn't designed to give a single sort of standard, quote unquote, standard bus that agencies will procure. It's really more a way to help agencies like easing the process of giving them language they can use. But there's a lot of different options in there that agencies are able to select from. And that is, I think, one of the challenges that we find, at least in the US experience, is that agencies do tend to really want very kind of bespoke or customized bus design specs. We are developing an electric bus specification language to this, to add to this. It's been a bit of a lengthy process, as some of our members will tell you. We are coming around to agreement on on language. This is a consensus-based process. That's one reason why it takes a while. That's how our standards program works. And but I am hoping to we've had the document in public review, but I'm hoping to have it officially published actually fairly shortly, certainly this summer. And then I guess just a couple of my thoughts on procurement and joint procurement. My general sense is that I think joint procurements have certainly been useful and can be useful in when you have a new technology, and evolving a new technology. Firstly, because agencies are perhaps unfamiliar with it, so it helps to leverage expertise across agencies. So that's a benefit. And of course, there is always the desire to achieve economies of scale. My experience from past work is that has worked reasonably successfully with fuel cell buses kind of early on. There is actually an initiative underway in the US right now of transit agencies working together as a consortium on buses with automation, with advanced automation features. So that is definitely, I think, a good vehicle when you have early technology development and you're trying to achieve, like I said, those economies of scale. We do, of course, have joint procurements in the US for buses. We have them for regular buses and also now for electric buses. My sense is that it perhaps is less in the US context about reaching some economies of scale, and it's more that you have small agencies. Again, they're able to work together, and they are able to kind of leverage certainly greater power by bringing together the procurements that they're doing. But they're not really kind of necessarily creating like a standard across the industry. But it is certainly, I think, a helpful procurement vehicle. Again, certainly for smaller agencies where they perhaps have kind of more limited staffing, and it just is helpful for them to be able to band together. And then I guess Steve did mention the charging infrastructure thing. That is, I think, an important issue as well. Again, as I mentioned, I find generally in the US, agencies tend to like fairly sort of bespoke procurements for buses. And that can be a bit of a challenge. Charging infrastructure, I think because we're moving now more towards interoperability, I feel that is something that's going to be easier to accomplish in some of these joint procurements. That's not necessarily going to be as much of a challenge. And just also as sort of another note, there's also in the US, states often have purchasing vehicles for fleets, and they put on, they'll put on like hybrid sedans and things like that fleets can purchase. And so there's been an attempt in some states to do that as well with buses, and specifically with electric buses. So that is another approach that we've tried to see if we can help agencies purchase electric buses in the US. So I'll stop there.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa. And to that point, over the last few years, CUTRIC led a quasi-joint procurement initiative with Vancouver, Brampton, York region, and where we coordinated the big funding package. And in order to do that, we had to standardize the electric powertrain and the charging system. So everybody got the same bus and the charging system models across multiple manufacturers, but then each agency ended up doing its final procurement so they could add in their specs, and there was some price variability. And we found that worked, but it did take several years. So we're going to come back to that in more detail in terms of different ways to approach joint procurement, where we're looking at the powertrain and the chargers, but maybe allowing variability on everything else, like the wheels and the seats and all of that stuff. So coming back to that, but first we're going to go to Mike Dolman. Mike, I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to you as we get your presentation up there for your insights.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at today's event. I'm very excited about it. So my name is Mike Dolman. I'm Associate Director at Energy. So just to give you a little bit of context where we're coming from, we're a low carbon energy consultancy practice based in the UK. We also have offices in France and Australia. We've got teams of experts that cover all the main areas of energy use, buildings, transport, energy systems, networks, industry. I myself specialise in the hydrogen sector, hydrogen fuel cells. And one of the things we do a lot of in this space is essentially supporting the formation and delivery of innovative projects related to demonstrate the technology in the real world. So we played a central role in bringing together the consortia that are now, and we're now coordinating many of the major hydrogen transport demonstration projects underway in Europe, covering light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles with buses and trucks. But today I'm going to focus particularly on the on joint procurement experiences from the so-called JIVE program. So I think it's useful if we just go to start, works good. If we start with a bit of context. So I'm going to talk particularly about fuel cell buses here, and fuel cell buses are currently at, I guess, a stage between technology demonstration and full commercialization. And on this slide, you can see some of the timing of some of the major European fuel cell bus demonstration projects that have happened over the past decade or so. All of these have been supported by this organisation called the Fuel Cells and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking, or the FCHJU. And you can see some of the previously completed projects, like the so-called CHIC project. And others. Basic conclusion from this is that demonstrating small fleets of buses, tens of buses, etc. Technology works under the right conditions, but a lack of scale and inventory supply chains and high costs were all key issues that had to be addressed. So in parallel to some of those demonstration activities, there was also a number of strategic planning activities, and that's what these reports are kind of indicating on the slide here. And for example, this coalition study that was published back in 2015, one of the key conclusions of that was that large-scale coordinated deployment was the order of 300 to 400 buses across Europe was a logical next step to help move the sector forward. So the FCHJU themselves continue to support this sector. So they funded some work that we led on strategies for joint procurement, and there's some reports available from their website that we did in 2016 and 17. But also they put 57 million euros of funding in a couple of their annual calls towards real-world demonstration projects, and that led to the so-called JIVE projects, which was already based around using this approach, this idea of joint procurement to create the scale to help bring down the costs and therefore the prices of buses, and really act as a stepping stone towards commercialization of the technology in Europe and beyond. So this is just an overview of the JIVE program, and it's looking to demonstrate, I say, fuel cell buses at a larger scale than ever before, and really helping to try and catalyse further uptake. So, one of the conditions of the funding that was made available was that the buses had to be priced below certain levels. So they set 650 or 625,000 euros for the base vehicle. It's still quite high relative to a traditional diesel bus, but it was a lot lower than previous projects. And the basic idea is with the funding, you could then make a plausible offer to the transport operators for operating the vehicles. I think the other thing that's worth remembering about this project is that it's structured in a way where basically the public sector organisations are buying and owning the buses. So the funding is directed to them, and they run procurement exercises, and then suppliers of the technology essentially kind of sit outside of the formal projects. And so far, procurement exercises have been undertaken for buses and refueling infrastructure in most of the 20 or so different cities, and around half the buses have been ordered to date, and those that haven't are at pretty advanced stages of contracting discussions. So just a quick example, if we dive into an approach to joint procurement that's been taken in this overall programme, here is an example in London, in the UK. Transport for London led an exercise to establish what we call a joint procurement framework, and that was all based around a kind of common base specification for buses. So we developed an approach. They ran a competitive procurement exercise back in 2017, and this framework went live in 2018. And the basic idea of this is that it allows demands from multiple customers to be aggregated, so that suppliers see a much larger sort of order or collection of orders, which obviously helps bring down the costs, increase standardization, and benefits everyone involved. It's also worth mentioning that the framework was set up in a way that allows other customers, not just UK companies and organisations, to use it, although to date the only orders have actually been through via UK participants. So some of the high-level conclusions from the JIVE project. I think we're seeing that we're observing growing interest in offering fuel cell buses from suppliers in Europe and beyond. I think the procurement exercises on the whole have been successful in achieving what they set out to in terms of the target prices, provided that the customers can commit to sufficient volumes of vehicles in individual locations. I think overall, again, in terms of the joint procurement, I'm sure we'll get into a discussion about it, but it's been successful in aggregating demands and showing that to the supply side. But I think the strategy is not without its drawbacks, and I think this will come back to some of those points later as well. The other thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the infrastructure side of things. So we talked a lot about buses, but it's also worth remembering, of course, that you have to think about hydrogen supplies and infrastructure at the same time. So you need to consider this approach to procurement of the infrastructure too. And the final thing I want to make is that there's a lot of focus on the capital costs of vehicles and new technologies, but it's really important to consider the overall costs as well, the maintenance, cost of spares. All these things are very important factors to consider. Obviously, they're critical for the total cost of ownership. So that's a very brief kind of run-through overview of the JIVE program. I hope provided some useful thoughts, and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic segue right into the first set of questions. So we're going to kick off with two questions. One where we're going to ask you to offer high level, based on everything you know, what is the top opportunity associated with joint procurements from your perspective? I'm going to ask you to hold off on the challenges because we're going to come back to that. But what's the one top opportunity if you had to advise agencies of the benefit of doing a joint procurement around battery electric bus or hydrogen fuel cell bus from your experience? And are there any differences fundamentally from a joint procurement just otherwise for CNGs or diesels? So top opportunity for battery electric bus or fuel cell electric bus joint procurement. And please hold on your challenges and we'll come back to that. So Lisa, we're going to start with you and from your experience so far, top opportunity. Oh, 1 second, Lisa. We're just going to unmute you there. There you go.
There we go. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I do feel that I was interested to see what Mike was talking about, and I think the fuel cell opportunity is a really interesting one right now, just because of where that technology is. I feel like that really could benefit from this kind of a push. And I know it's something that's been obviously done before and talked about before. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm kind of most intrigued by it from perhaps from the fuel cell side. And how that could potentially kind of move that technology forward faster, so the agencies have those options when they're looking at zero emission buses.
So the top benefit would be system-wide, essentially, getting to the volumes to get the technology moving faster from an innovation standpoint.
I think so. I mean, it's been interesting to watch if you want to call it like a sort of a race of fuel cells and batteries, and I've been watching it for a long time, and there was a time when fuel cells really had a lot of the advantages, and then battery electric side kind of came to the fore. But I know there's a lot of interest, certainly in the U.S. agencies, in what fuel cell technology could offer if they're going full zero emission. And I know you all have talked about that. So to me, I just think that's an interesting way to try to use this mechanism to sort of push that faster, and then we can really kind of see, what works for agencies and which technology works in which type of service.
That's great. Okay, so volume procurement leads to volume deployment and volume lessons learned. So Steve, over to you based on your experiences. In particular, you noted a couple examples there. So top opportunity associated with joint procurement from your perspective.
I think the greatest opportunity is for transit agencies to develop an understanding of these technologies. Every time we take an agency that, say they're just doing a pilot project, has never done a zero emission bus project before, there's a tremendous amount of learning and education that takes place just going through the process. So in a joint procurement, especially if the primary lead agency has done it before, certainly if you're an agency that hasn't had that experience, partnering in a joint application, you're going to learn a tremendous amount about the technology, about the constraints, about the benefits of the technology, just going through the process.
So there's a learning for the lead agency in particular. If you had a TTC or a TransLink or an Edmonton Transit, be the lead agency, boy, are they going to learn an encyclopedia of knowledge just doing a procurement. Yeah. So Rapid University on electrification for an entire fleet system with rapid innovation if we get to the right volumes. And Mike, from your perspective, what's the top opportunity of going to joint procurements for this tech?
Yeah, I think I would echo that point. I think it's a point Lisa made in her presentation as well about this learning point. So, the experience we had in the UK and to some extent other clusters in the JIVE project, both so London had already deployed fleets of fuel cell buses, as had Aberdeen, whereas we'd also had new cities that came in with no experience. So that learning was really important. I guess, but for me, I think the top opportunity is probably for fuel cell buses, it's around standardization and then getting to the scale and the continuity of demand, and showing that pipeline of continuity of demand to the suppliers. I think those things are really crucial for moving the technology out of, one-off bespoke, build a bus in the corner of a workshop type response to exercises, to actually turning it into, to make it commercial, it needs to be produced, in a series way. So give manufacturers an opportunity to set up dedicated production lines, work with their supply chains to get drive efficiencies and costs down. all those things I think are crucial for commercializing the technology. So I think that's a key one. And then I guess the final point I'd make is, it's also potentially more attractive for suppliers to respond to, one aggregated demand sort of signal than have to respond to, 10 different procurement exercises for slightly different things. So I think that's another kind of useful thing that the joint procurement can give.
Yeah, so maybe to summarize it all, the joint procurement leads to the volume deployment, volume innovation, volume lessons learned, and volume manufacturing lessons learned to also reduce unit price and production costs, right? So all sounds good, but as we've heard from our manufacturing partners, as we pursue joint procurement for all of these reasons in Canada right now, looking at this option, manufacturers love joint procurement when they win it. Hate it when they lose it. And that is clearly one of the big risks. You go big and you win big, or you lose big. So from your experience, in our experience with our electric bus project, we were able to get New Flyer and Nova Bus together in an 18 bus procurement, and ABB and Siemens together in a 7 charger procurement across 3 cities. It was really difficult to do, but we had a lot of manufacturers being extremely collaborative in a way that all of them said they'd never done before. Trying to grow that to 100 buses, another level of difficulty to get kind of interoperability, or rather multi-manufacturer alignment. That's a challenge I could see, is just doing that without limiting it to one manufacturer as a solution. So going to yourselves, Steve, we'll start with you. What's the biggest challenge for joint procurements going to battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell bus based on what you've experienced so far?
I think, as I mentioned before, the biggest challenge is, will the bus that was selected by the lead agency work in the environment that's with the sub-agencies? And I think for the most part, it'll work. Maybe it won't work in what the agency would have expected it to work in, or how it would work. But that's where the secondary evaluation analysis comes into play. And I think if the joint procurement is structured correctly, the lead agency will put in for the number of buses they want plus the number of options they want. The participating agency will also put in for options on that same order or contract. So at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out for the participating agency, if what the lead agency selected is not appropriate, the secondary agency can always back out, and those options can then be reassigned to another agency. So there's really no disadvantage to it at all, but we do caution agencies to take their time and do their homework and do their evaluation to make sure what they're going to buy is going to work in their environment.
Yeah, on that, if I can just ask for a little bit of clarification, in the case where the secondary agency did end up differing in battery pack size, right? Presumably the rest of the bus was the same, but the battery pack size differed. Were there volume pricing benefits in the end, or would it have been the same had they just gone and done their own analysis and procurement?
Well, the volume pricing benefit will come in the base model that was identified by the lead agency. So generally, what we would do is we'd create the entire procurement is based on what the lead agency wants, and then we would create an appendix to identify those differences in configuration required or requested by the sub-agencies. Generally, those differences are going to be things like radios and seats and paint scheme and these kind of things, not so much the drivetrain or a battery pack size. So it could be that whatever the lead agency selects, in the one case that I mentioned before with Proterra, the volume pricing would have come into play with the 440s, and then when the secondary agency negotiated their contract, the price would have been adjusted for the 660 kilowatt hour pack. Now, it could be that whenever the lead agency makes their selection, those type of drivetrain configurations aren't available from the vendor that they had selected. So in that case, the secondary agency would need to kind of bow out of that procurement, and those options could be reassigned to someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm just wondering if, and we'll come back to it, if a joint procurement is literally 2 agencies, and then one backs out, there really is no volume. And to what extent is the
Yeah.
I'm looking at, 4 to 5 agencies to buffer for that. Okay, so what we'll do is, Steve, we'll come back to you in a moment because I know you probably want to jump in on that, but let me just get the challenges from Mike, and then Lisa will come to you. So Mike, if we had to identify one top challenge, what would you see from your drive experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big challenges in this, the downside of the joint procurement, is the level of resource needed to actually just get through doing the process to get to a procurement exercise and run it. So, agreeing the strategy, agreeing the base specifications, and all those details. Obviously, the more parties you've got involved with a stake in it, the more complex and difficult that can become. So I think that's definitely a big challenge. I mean, if you asked, we were lucky because we had Transport for London volunteered or were volunteered to lead the exercise. If you ask them now, would you want to do that again? They're not sure they'd say yes, knowing what they do now. So it's I think for me that's one of the big challenges. Can I just make one other point on the point you made about this tension, I guess, between with suppliers? They love joint procurement if they win and don't if they don't. Obviously, I think with fuel cell buses there is this tension between wanting to create a competitive market where you've got real competition and things going on, but also needing to achieve scale. So and there's this tension between the two. And I guess what the framework that we've set up in the UK tries to do is have a little bit of both. So as I said, there's a framework where that allows the suppliers to be the way that you actually place an order is by running these mini competitions or call-offs at any time during the 4-year period, and by having you can basically go to the suppliers that are on the framework and still run some kind of competition to kind of to get the best possible price, and that also allows you to lock in cost reductions that might have occurred since you started the procurement at the beginning. So I think that's quite a neat solution to some of those challenges.
And we'll come back to that. Actually, that could be quite a workable starting point for some of the challenges that you've identified. With that, Lisa, I'm going to move to you for top challenges you see ahead, given the position you're in.
I really do think that, I hate to just kind of chime in on what everyone has been saying, but I do feel that the challenge really does lie in kind of coming up with a specification that will work across agencies. Now, having said that, if you think of small agencies usually they're kind of clustered in a geographic area, at least in the US anyway, working together. So at least they avoid some of the issues that you might have of buses operating quite differently in different climatic conditions. So that's certainly something that helps. But it really is making sure, like Steve said, you have to do your due diligence on making sure that the spec that you're putting out will really work in your routes and your operation. But of course, that's true in any case. I mean, that's true for any electric bus procurement. I mean, that's the advice that you would give any agency that's going out to bid for electric buses, is to be very careful that you understand, and I would recommend a third party sort of evaluation potentially of how different buses will work and what you need in your routes. And so, in a sense, it's not a particular challenge to joint procurements as such. It's just a general something that any agency really needs to think carefully about.
Mm-hmm. And going forward into this landscape, then, we do have some questions on the back end about, is there anything fundamentally different from just normal joint procurement and the challenges of normal joint procurement? Anything that battery electric or fuel cell electric world puts forward that makes it different? And I would proposition, and I'd love to hear your feedback, that the big difference is integration of the supply chain of fuel or electricity, that you can't just go buy a CNG bus or a hybrid bus or a diesel bus in the same way you buy battery electric and fuel cell, because we're at the stage where you shouldn't really be doing joint procurements without the charging systems, the fueling system or supply chain, and possibly even the smart controls around that, and the controlling software and the control systems. So with that, Steve, I'll turn to you. Are there fundamental differences here at play because of the nature of the technology and the supply chain involved? And what would those be? Oh, I think we've muted you there. There you go.
Here you go. I would agree with exactly what you say. And I think Lisa brought the point up before about interoperability. And we have seen interoperability challenges recently, and I think they're working through the system. But right now, at the moment, it's a lot safer to purchase the chargers with the bus. So that way, the responsibility for interoperability lies on the manufacturer. So that reduces the agency risk. I would see that, over time, within the next few years, when interoperability is not an issue, we can certainly do separate procurements for charging infrastructure versus the bus, so that a joint procurement could focus on the bus, and then the individual agency can focus on purchasing their own infrastructure.
Yeah, and maybe, Steve, if I can ask you just to maybe clarify a little bit, because we now have J3105 and we have J1772, and nobody's really going to J3068, but maybe they will. So we've got enough standards for high power and low power. And what we found, and I'll ask you this question, ask that Mike and Lisa maybe also reflect on this. What we found is, oddly, in the last few years, agencies, to some extent, folks within agencies have sometimes become ideologically committed to the idea of depot charging versus en route charging. So if you try to integrate the charging systems, you'll get opposition to depot versus en route, and it's almost ideological, even though it's just a matter of physics. How far can your bus go? How much energy can you get? Like, it's really a matter of physics and mathematics, not ideology. But somehow it's become almost culturally ideological. I think we're coming out of that now, because empirical evidence is just the laws of physics don't lie. You can only pack so much energy density into a certain volume of space. But having said that, that would complicate the joint procurement integrating charging if you have an agency that's just committed to slow charging at the depot and will not budge even when they see the modeling on that philosophy. That could complicate matters. So could you just clarify a little bit your comments there about integrating the charging systems? We have the standards, but is perhaps that ideology what's underpinning the difficulty of going there?
So yeah, two parts to that. So the standards are great, but I often find the standards, they're hardware standards basically, and they may be insufficient for the bus and the chargers to actually work together, because there's always some software integration issues and parameters that need to be reset. So not an insurmountable problem, it just takes time. Now, regarding the whole depot versus en route charging, I see it kind of as a pendulum shift here. In the very early days, 10 years ago, let's say, everything was en route charge because the battery packs were very small. Then we started shifting toward larger battery packs, which enabled depot charging, which was a lot less expensive option than en route charging. So there was a big shift toward depot charging. Now that agencies are getting through their initial pilot projects, and you can do a small pilot depot charge project for fairly low cost, relatively, let's put it that way. But now that agencies have gotten past that and they're starting to recognize how to best operate these vehicles and understand the constraints of these vehicles and wanting to push the envelope more, they're recognizing that maybe depot charging isn't enough and I need to have a mixture of both depot and en route, or going to fuel cells. So we're starting to see a lot more conversation take place around the option to go to fuel cell or back to en route charging.
Yeah, and I would say it's being tethered both the empirical evidence from pilots that have gone beyond 1 to 2 buses. They're seeing the reality of what's happening on the road. And then more agencies are now doing modeling, right? And we've been part of that. You've been part of that. The laws of physics don't lie. So heading into that, Lisa, comment tree there, are there fundamental differences on these procurements when it's battery, electric, and fuel cell that just, APTA hasn't faced on CNG hybrids and diesels in the past? And then perhaps you may want to comment on this issue of the charging integration.
Well, on the question of the charging integration, actually, I think I mentioned briefly that we are going to develop a specification in our bus procurement guidelines around the infrastructure piece, which we don't do for the other bus fuels. It's just kind of understood that this is, it's a really important part of it. It's something that's unfamiliar, of course, broadly across transit. It's relatively new. And I do think, to put a kind of a more positive, note on some of this, I think as we're seeing buses with longer range, just because of the battery technology improving, as we're seeing some standardization with the charging infrastructure, some of these complications are lessened if you're doing a joint procurement. I think you'll find that it's easier to have a bus that's going to meet different, route needs, and so I think it will over time. It's getting easier. Will continue to be get easier. I do want to make a quick comment on the depot versus en route charging, which I do think is I agree with Steve's assessment as to how it's kind of gone in the industry. But I think that certainly some of it is like a, kind of ideological or cultural thing. I mean, agencies are accustomed to how they fuel buses right now. And that's, to come in and really upend that can be challenging. But there also are some practical challenges, I think, for agencies if they're going to do on route in terms of getting the power there, and do they have right of way, and do they have the space? And there's some complications, I think. So I think that could be one of the reasons why people get locked into the idea of doing depot charging.
Very helpful. And as we pursue forward, we're looking at integrating innovative financing as well. So at that point, you're starting to look at a public-private partnership with design, build, operate, and maintain. So we're looking at bus, charger, facility design, finance it all, and operate and maintain services, and package that all into one big joint procurement. Massively complex, but Canada's a small economy. So the reality is it actually isn't as difficult as I think it might be in the United States, because we're really trying to get to the right volumes with much smaller populations, smaller fleets. So with that, Mike, over to you. I think Jive probably has the most experience worldwide, at least if world is very Eurocentric and North American centric. We're talking about North America and Europe. The most experience we've seen, and I've been at several Jive meetings in Europe at the UITP conferences, seeing some of the updates in recent years. There's a lot of experience. You're already into round 2. So from your experience there, looking at, is there fundamental differences in terms of hydrogen procurement over what diesel and CNG would have been in the past? And then if you wanted to comment on this issue of adding in the systems, because how do you add in fueling systems and fueling supply chains into a joint procurement?
Absolutely. I think it's a really good point. It's definitely something to be aware of. So definitely differences compared to traditional buses, of course. You need to think about the infrastructure. So one of the debates we had quite early on in the process of joint procurement is, well, we're doing joint procurement of buses, should we also do joint procurement of stations, hydrogen infrastructure? We pretty quickly concluded no. And the reasons for that were mainly because the potential advantages in terms of standardization and cost reductions for stations, which weren't really there in the same way. Small number of pieces of infrastructure compared to like tens or hundreds or thousands of buses. It just wasn't going to be, the benefits weren't going to be there. And also the fact that it was going to be basically, it's hard enough to agree a common sort of base specification of bus, but agreeing a common specification for a station, a hydrogen station, is going to be very difficult, given that each location, each city will have different requirements. So different sources of fuel, the way they operate is different refueling windows, the time you need to fill all the fleet in, how long do you want to fill per bus? All these things are quite location specific. So coming up with a common spec for that would be basically really difficult. So mostly the kind of clusters that have done joint procurement have, on the whole, done joint procurement for buses and then let each customer worry about the infrastructure solution. I guess the operability point is less of a problem, I think, with fuel cell buses, because there are these common like SAE standards for refueling protocols and the geometry of the nozzle. So you can be sure you specify, I want a bus with this connector. You're pretty sure your station can give you nozzles that'll fit it. So that's less of a problem. One example of the project that rather than doing joint procurement with other parties where they bundle this all together, the kind of offer you're describing was Pau in the south of France. So they did a procurement. They wanted not just the buses, but they wanted the fueling station. They were looking for offers for the whole package essentially. And there are definitely some advantages of that. I think that what you need to be aware of is, I guess, the readiness of the industry to respond to that kind of request. Like you say, that implies that you'll need consortia of companies to come together and join forces to give a joint offer, which I guess also speaks to one of the key learnings through the Drive projects is really the importance of the early market engagement activities. And before you do the formal kind of procurement exercises, speaking to the potential suppliers, really understanding where they are with the technology, what kind of things they might be able to do and what they can't do, so that to avoid developing what looks like if you've got a great response to this all bells and whistles procurement exercise. It's no good if no one can actually respond and meet what you're asking for. So I would say that's something that you definitely need to be. I mean, this is quite common sense, but it's something not to forget when designing these kind of schemes.
And actually, that point's entirely apropos, because even up to about 2 years ago or so, we were still fielding questions from the federal government, as well as our transit agency members, who were saying, well, look, like if we want a 188 kilowatt hour battery pack with this particular charging system, we're going to put out an RFP. And our answer was, nobody's going to answer it because it's not available. You can count on your hand the number of manufacturers who make hydrogen fuel cell stacks, the powertrains that are available on bus models. There's 2 really in Canada. In the number of battery electric bus manufacturers, there's 4 really that are readily available in Canada. It's a very small industry. I won't say monopolistic, but almost so. It's not the auto industry where we got 50 makes and models of manufacturers that we can pick and choose from. So going into that point, we've now got a series of questions that are specific to each of you. So I'm going to go through a few of them and ask for a few rapid fire answers to the extent that you can. So this question, first off, Mike, for yourself in Europe, very specifically questioned from our colleagues in Winnipeg. Aaron Cook at Winnipeg Transit, is 350 bar versus 700 bar still being debated at all in Europe for hydrogen pressure? How future-proof would the hydrogen infrastructure be at this point compared to electric charging systems in Europe for those kinds of RFPs? Oh, Mike, we've got you on mute there. There we go.
Quick answer for buses. I'm not aware of anyone talking about 700 bar in Europe. So basically, for buses, it's 350 bar, as far as I know. The debate's still open a little bit on trucks, other heavy-duty vehicles. Mostly for passenger cars, it's most of the major passenger cars, as you probably know, is 700 bar. There are some smaller smaller vehicle developers that are also using 350 bar for cars, but the infrastructure you need for a fleet of buses is very different from what you need for a car station. So there's not really a kind of problem around that, I think.
Okay, very helpful. So then, Lisa, Steve, a question for you guys, to the extent that you're able to reference the experiences you've had or the exposure. Certainly, Steve, we'll start with you. In your experience, is it possible for more than one bus manufacturer to be awarded a joint procurement as part of a joint procurement? And what we're getting at here is, if the volume's big enough, could you envision that 2 manufacturers with 2 different products are awarded a certain number of units within a joint procurement? There we go. We've got you on the data.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly possible to do that, but again, to your point, Josipa, if it all depends on the volume of buses that you're purchasing, and then if you're going to dedicate certain attributes to one vendor versus another. So remember, when a vendor sees that it's not going to be a sole award, that will be reflected in their pricing. You're not going to get as good a pricing as you would if the entire contract would be going toward that one vendor.
Very helpful to know. So we'll have to balance the size and the volume against the benefit of joint procurement to start with, which is presumably
Right.
the cost. Lisa, a question for you, to the extent that you have experience with this, and in your view, how effective has the U.S. state procurement schedule been in terms of managing either joint procurements or the integration of zero emissions buses?
I will say that I know somewhat about what's happened at the state level. I don't have a sense at the moment that it has played a particularly strong role. And Steve, I don't know if you might have a different view on that, but that's not my sense thus far. Although in some cases it's still relatively early going, that states have even been able to develop an electric bus specific spec that they can put into their state procurement schedules. So I think that it's an interesting, it's a potential avenue. But I haven't seen it really play a especially large role at the moment, as opposed to more. I do think more so you see joint agency procurements as kind of vehicle.
Yeah, very helpful. And we're getting mixed signals on it. We've looked at this as a model to follow some really interesting things happening in those state schedules that we could mimic, but it's not clear to us without doing a full deep dive interview of manufacturers and agencies how effective it's been and whether a different model would have worked better. And Steve, I'm not sure if you want to add there.
Yeah, I think the advantage to agencies have been is that they can accelerate their procurement. They don't need to go through the RFP process now because it's essentially been done for them by the state. Now, the downside, currently there are 3 state procurements out there that you can purchase off of in the U.S. I think the downside is that not all manufacturers are represented on each one of the state procurements, and neither do they have all their models available on each one of the state procurements. So that's a little bit of a challenge. Keep in mind also that the state agencies that went for these procurements weren't transit agencies, so they may not have, whoever's doing those procurements may not have understood all the nuances that we deal with when a transit agency goes out for procurement.
Yeah, and that's one of the pieces of feedback we've received is to the extent that you can lobby the state to get some kind of preference, that does that appear in the state procurement? And that's a big unknown right now. So we continue to investigate, and we're certainly excited to be able to draw from information from experiences in California, Lisa across the United States, and Mike in Europe. We've unfortunately come to the end of our panel, and there's still more questions, but I do encourage folks to join us at the networking at the end of today. Yesterday, we changed the methodology for networking sessions, and we put it all into one big room, and everybody had their glass of wine and their chamomile tea, and it was all good fun. So we've created another networking session at the end of today, backed by popular demand. So if you folks are available a little bit later today and you want to share a glass of virtual wine or a pint of beer, we'd ask that you do join so some folks here can ask the questions that they didn't get a chance to have answered. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. We really appreciate it. A great panel. And please join us at our next session that's starting in just a few moments. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.